This is lesson 15-2 and it covers multiple populations and inferences. When you analyze a group, you usually have a question that you want answered about that group. You use one population when you have a question about a trait of the whole group, like how many students in my school play a sport. They're all students at the school, and so you would be looking at the whole group as one big group, and you would ask everyone in that group. You use two populations when you want to compare two groups or two parts of a group. So if you were asking the question, are students who play a sport generally taller than students who don't play a sport, you would have to group your people into people that play sports and people that don't play sports. And then you could compare them and see if the ones that play sports are taller than the ones who don't. And it doesn't have to just stop at two populations. You can have more than two as well. Like, for example, this question, how many students play a sport in each grade? And so you would divide the students up into groups, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, and then you could ask them the question and compare the groups to see maybe if more students play a sport in one grade over another. So it's all about if you need to ask a question of the whole group all together, or if you need to break the group into parts so that you can study each part and compare them. A teacher gave a test to each of her 3 math classes. To answer each question, should the teacher consider the class as 3 populations or as 1 population? So in order to answer this question, we need to be thinking, would we put everyone in the same group and ask them the question, or will we divide them up by class and ask the question of each class? What was the highest score overall? Well, overall is a good keyword telling us that we're talking about all the classes, not just one or the other, but all the classes all together. So we would think of this as one population. Which is the top scoring class? Well, if we want to know which is the top scoring class, we want to know, is it, the first hour math class, the second hour math class, or the third hour math class? And in order to do that, we have to separate them out by math class. So we would not just have one big overall group, but we would be looking at each of the classes and then comparing the scores. What is the mean score in each class? Since we want to know what the mean or average score is for each class, we're going to have to think of this as 3 populations. So we would separate out the classes and find the mean of each one. Who is the top scoring student in each class? Again, the words each class are letting us know that we need to go to each class individual, like just look at first hour, what's the top scoring student, then look at second hour, what's the top scoring student, and lastly, look at third hour. So you would not put them all together in one big group, but you would think about them as 3 separate groups. What is the mean score of all the students? So we're not talking about what class they're in. We don't even care. We just want to know what's the average score of all students. That would be thinking of all of the students as one large population. How does the range of scores compare among classes? So we want to compare the classes. That means we would have to find the range of each class and then compare them. So we would think of them as 3 groups. The school nurse tested the eyesight of all of the students in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. To answer each question, should the nurse consider the grades as 3 populations or as one large population? Go ahead and pause the video, try this one out, and then play the video to see if you did it correct. How many students have perfect vision in the school? This is talking about the whole school, not caring about what grade they're in. So we would think of this as one large population. We're just thinking of all the students at the school. What is the mean eyesight score for each grade? If we want to look at each grade and find the mean of each grade, we have to think of the groups as 3 separate populations. So we have to find the mean of 7th grade, find the mean of 8th grade, and find the mean of 6th grade too. Do students' eyesight scores change more between 6th and 7th grades or between 7th and 8th grades? This, again, we would have to think of as 3 populations because we would have to look at each grade and then see how much of a change happens between the grades. We have to consider what grade they're in. We're not just thinking of them overall as a big group in the school, but we're considering what grade they're in order to answer this question. Why can one population in a study be considered more than one population in another study? We've seen several examples of this already, but it just depends on what you want to know about. We've seen several examples already, but one example you could consider is you might want to know, oops, the most popular color at your school. So that would be one big population. Or you might want to know what each grade's most popular color is. Or maybe even what each team's most popular color is. And then you would consider that as multiple populations depending on how many grades were at your school. In our case, we have 2 grades, so we would consider as 2 populations. A researcher is analyzing United States Census data.
Here in Maine.
With my family in Philadelphia.
Came to Chicago.
3rd generation in Los Angeles.
Grew up here in Hawaii.
The census is a survey that's sent to everyone that lives in the United States, or it's sent to a lot of people that live in the United States, and it's just kind of a survey to study the people that live in the U.S. For each question, how many populations should the researcher use? Describe the populations. Okay, do more people live in Maine or Hawaii? Well, we would have to find out how many people live in Maine, and we would have to figure out how many people live in Hawaii, and then we could compare them. So that would be 2 populations. We would have to study Maine and Hawaii. Is the median number of people per residence greater in Chicago, Los Angeles, or Philadelphia? Well, we would have to find the mean number of people per residence in Chicago. We would have to find the median number of people per residence in Los Angeles, and we would have to find the median number of people per residence in Philadelphia, and then we could compare them. So this would be 3 populations, Chicago, LA, and Philadelphia. What is the age of the oldest U.S. citizen? Well, in this case, it's like it doesn't really matter what state they come from. We're just talking about the whole United States as one big group. What's the age of the oldest person in the United States? We would consider this as one population, and we would just be looking at the whole United States. USA. What percent of each state's population is male? Well, we want to look at each state's percentage of male residents, then we would need to investigate each state. And so that would be 50 populations. We would have to study each state. So sometimes we have multiple populations because we want to divide our larger group into smaller groups and learn something about each one of those smaller groups so that we can compare them. A scientist is analyzing sea urchin samples taken from the ocean. For each question, how many populations should the scientist use and describe the populations? So this is like our last example. Go ahead, pause the video, try it out, and make sure you can do this problem correctly. How many species of sea urchins exist? Well, this would be considered one overall population. We're looking at all of the sea urchins. And then we are figuring out what types or what kinds we have. Which continent has the greatest population of sea urchins along its coast? Well, this would be 7 populations. We're going to have to study each continent and see how many sea urchins they have, and then we can compare and decide who has the greatest. Do more sea urchins live in the Atlantic Ocean or in the Pacific Ocean? This would be 2 populations. We would study the Atlantic, how many sea urchins live there, and we would study the Pacific, how many sea urchins live there, and then we could decide where more sea urchins live. You can make inferences about populations using random samples from each population. We've talked about this word before. I know you've even talked about it in other classes. An inference is like an educated guess. So you can make a note about that on your note page so that you don't forget what an inference is. So we're going to take a sample, like this purple bubble of this big population, and we'll take this green bubble of this bigger population. And because we'll have a little sample, if they're good samples, then we'll be able to learn more about the whole group, and we'll make a guess about comparing the populations. We're going to know for sure what's going on in the sample parts, but we don't know exactly about the population. We just hope it is representative whenever we take our sample. An inference is when you make a judgment by interpreting a set of data. You are making an inference. When you make a judgment by interpreting a set of data, you are making an inference. So an example would be if you study population A, or sample A, and 65% of the sample likes to sing, you could assume or educatedly guess that 65% of the whole population likes to sing. If you take this small green sample and you find out that 30% like to sing, then you would make an educated guess that 30% of the whole population in the bigger bubble would also like to sing. Comparative inferences, the word comparative has that word compare in it, is just whenever you're comparing two populations. So based on sample A and sample B, it seems that a greater percentage of population A would like to sing than population B would. Okay, I'll go ahead and pause the video right here. You can play the next video to watch part 2.